Hi there, welcome to the 110th episode of the Ask Dr. Khan Show. Today we're talking about brain. So we've been talking about your most precious organ, the brain, in the past 2 weeks, and we're going to continue that conversation. And we have talked about what it takes to make the brain healthy. We talked about how you need to have fuel and activation. Your brain cells must be fed, and the primary source of energy for the brain is oxygen and glucose. That's why you have to make sure you're absorbing food, so you're getting the proper amount of iron, so you don't become anemic. Many people with leaky gut or poor absorption, they have trouble with anemia, chronic anemia. We have a lot of clients who have helped over the years who have chronic anemia, and they're always taking iron supplements, but once we fix their absorption issue, they are no longer anemic, and they no longer need iron supplements. Also, we need to make sure you have steady supply of glucose to your brain. Now, you may think that, well, glucose, okay, great, let me eat some candy to give me some better brain function. Well, that's exactly the opposite thing you do, because when you eat sugar, your blood sugar rises, followed by a crash, and that crash is called reactive hypoglycemia, and so that's why you can have both high blood sugar symptom and low blood sugar symptom at the same time. So you want to actually keep your blood sugar real steady. That like eating more fiber from vegetables, higher healthy fat content, good amount of protein. That way you keep your blood sugar real steady and you don't get the highs and the lows. So that's really important to keep the brain fed for proper brain function. The other side of that is we talked about activation. Your brain cells must be activated in order for it to properly function. And you may think of activating the brain cells as far as using your brain or a thinking process. Certainly that's one way to activate it. It depends on what part of the brain we're talking about. And we're going to talk about different lobes of the brain. Now, the best way to activate the brain is actually through physical exercise. It's through movement. Movement is actually the fuel, the thing that keeps your brain cells alive. So we must move in order for proper brain function. So last week we talked about that in your brain, this is a model of the brain. Here's the front, here's the back, sitting like this. And in the front part of the brain, right here, it's called the frontal lobe. Now the frontal lobe is a part of the brain that's mainly concerned with executive function and emotion. So frontal lobe controls cognition and emotion and movement. That's what the frontal lobe does. That's what we talked about last week. So you can go back to the previous episode by scrolling down our Facebook timeline, or if you're following us on YouTube, you can watch episode 109 of the Ask Dr. Khan Show, where we talked about frontal lobe function. So because frontal lobe controls cognition, emotion, and movement, problem with frontal lobe, if your frontal lobe craps out because you lack fuel, you're not feeding yourself properly, or you have activation problem because you're not moving, or you don't do anything that's novel, you don't learn new things, or you have inflammation or toxicity that's causing inflammation. That can all cause your frontal lobe to start to become weak and even damaged, and you're going to start to have cognition problem. What does that look like? Brain fog, difficulty concentrating. You may not be able to inhibit yourself from doing socially inappropriate things. So this will be an example of children in school. Attention deficit, they're blurred out. They talk before they raise their hand. They act out. This is all lack of frontal lobe control. So you can't control your emotions. That's why people get road rage and they do stupid stuff. Or kids in school, they can't shut off their impulse, so they blurt out when they're not supposed to. And that gets labeled as ADHD, where simply they may have decreased frontal lobe function because they're either not eating the correct food, or they're inflamed, or they're not getting activated properly. Could be due to a left and the right hemispheric issue. That gets a little deeper. We may have a future episode we're going to talk about that. Emotion. If your frontal lobe is not functioning properly, you're going to become depressed. You're going to become lethargic. You're going to have lack of motivation. Frontal lobe demise can cause anxiety, can cause just where you don't enjoy things anymore. Things you used to enjoy, you don't enjoy anymore. The music you used to like to listen to, you don't like anymore. The food you used to like to eat, you just feel like, I can go without. So that's the color of your life, the quality of your life. It's all determined by your brain, and your frontal lobe ever more so. And lastly is movement. There's a area here called the premotor cortex and the primary motor cortex, which is right here in the back part of this frontal lobe. And today we're going to actually talk about this part of the brain called the parietal lobe. And you're going to see how the functions are very interesting set up to where it's helping each other. But this area is called the motor cortex, and it controls movement. So that's why I say, when you exercise, you're literally firing this part of the brain, getting them to become more active, right? Remember I said 2 primary needs of a neuron, of a brain cell, is fuel. Let me write this down for you, because it's so important. You've got to know that your brain cell requires fuel and activation. We talked about fuel being glucose, which comes from the food that you eat, and oxygen, which comes from breathing, come from having healthy red blood cell function, meaning not anemic. So, and then activation, which means movement, exercise, or thinking, doing cognitive processes, learning a new language, doing something that's new and novel. Your brain likes variety. You want to be doing different things all the time. So this is all just from neuroscience, and as a board-certified chiropractic neurologist, and having worked with clients with neurodegeneration, neurocognitive issues, brain fog, depression, anxiety, this is what we do day in and day out. Many people come to us with thyroid problem. Many people with thyroid problem have frontal lobe demise. Many people come to us with autoimmune disease. And these people with autoimmune disease have frontal lobe issues where they feel brain fog, they feel depressed, they feel lethargic, they have no motivation. This is all a consequence of frontal lobe dysfunction that may be caused by the autoimmune issue because of the inflammation, or caused by low thyroid because thyroid hormone is critical to helping the neurons, the brain cells, function properly and metabolize energy properly. That's why this is all linked together. And if you don't understand this, if you go to a provider that doesn't understand these things, they're going to dismiss your depression as a separate issue. They say, well, you're depressed. Here's Prozac, because that's have nothing to do with your thyroid. Or your depression has nothing to do with your gut, when in fact it has very much to do with your gut, very much to do with your thyroid, very much to do with your blood sugar level, very much to do with your ability to absorb, or if you're anemic. This is called a holistic approach, and that's what we do with our clients, okay? So if you're frustrated and you're having symptoms of these neurocognitive issues, you're just not getting answers, we can help you. We do Skype consultation and video consultation with clients all over the world. And this is done very elegantly through technology. So right, with technology these days, we can easily video conference you. I can order lab tests where you are. I get the results back. We share computer screen. I share my screen with you. You can see the test result. I go over with you number by number what that means. And we develop a customized eating plan, supplementation plan, and detoxification plan to help you address these issues. And next thing you know, boom, brain function comes back. It happens every time. Just like it's predictable, right? Because if you do the right things in the right order, in the right sequence, in the right amount, things should improve. And so we want to be that resource for you, okay? So we talked about activation, fuel and activation for frontal lobe. So that's what's last week. That was a recap. But again, remember, everything builds on one another, okay? So next thing is we're going to talk about is parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is this part of the brain, more further back. So on this brain model, it's going to be in this area. And if you were to touch your own parietal lobe on your skull, it'll be like right back here on the top and the back part of it. So this part of the brain is called parietal lobe. And what is the parietal lobe? Remember, the frontal lobe is movement. The parietal lobe is sensory. Sensory, meaning it feels things. The frontal lobe moves things. The parietal lobe feels things. The frontal lobe is sending out signal from the brain to the body so you can move your muscle. Remember, for you to move your bicep, for you to move your finger, your brain had to tell the finger to move. That signal comes from the brain out. That's called efferent pathway, outgoing. The afferent pathway, coming from the skin, from your body, from your joints, from your muscles, to know that you're moving, to know that you're being touched. That afferent information, incoming to the brain, is processed by the parietal lobe. Now, interestingly, without the parietal lobe, you have no frontal lobe. Let me say that again. Without sensory information, you have no movement. You see, your movement is driven by sensory information. See, your brain is basically a big old antenna. Your brain is a big antenna that pick up environmental stimuli through the 5 senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Through these environmental signals, your brain picks up all these incoming signals in the form of touch, sight, smell, and so forth, and it all eventually gets filtered through the parietal lobe, especially touch type of sensation, right? Now, smell goes to the olfactory bulb, which is a different part of the brain, and sight goes to the occipital lobe, but specifically touch all gets filtered through the parietal lobe. And without feeling things, without being able to detect what's going on in the environment, you do not have the ability to make a decision about which way to go, right? If you feel the temperature gets too cold, then your brain will say, it's getting cold. I better put some clothes on before I freeze to death. So then that affects what you're going to make a decision, cognition, or even emotion. Man, it's so cold, I am afraid I'm going to die. Fear of death. That drives you to take some action, which is put some coat on so you don't freeze to death. That drives the motor. So sensory information drives frontal lobe. That's just how important. You must have sensory input. So the parietal lobe is in charge of that. Now, more than just sensory, the parietal lobe is in charge of other function as well besides just touch. It also has it's involved in visual spatial processing, meaning it's able to detect shapes. It's able to detect symbols. So you can actually see things and know, oh, this is a square, this is a triangle, there's a tight space, there's a wide space. So this is how you're able to move about in space. Again, it has to do with sensory. How do you take that information from the environment and where is your body in relationship to your environment? So that's parietal lobe, very important. It's also involved in the knowledge of letters and numbers. Parietal lobe has also received the information from various different parts. So parietal lobe, like I said, is a very important part because it gets information from the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe sends information to it. This is the visual cortex. So visual information goes in, right? Because the visual information goes in here and your parietal lobe says, oh, this looks like an A, letter A. This looks like a letter B. So it actually can process visual information. So the occipital lobe actually sees the stuff. But for you to understand what you just saw is parietal lobe. It's sensory interpretation, where the occipital lobe is pure just data. Hey, I see this thing. And the parietal lobe tells you this thing is a triangle or a square or a dog or whatever. Okay, so that's so important. The parietal lobe also gets some information from the vestibular system. That's the inner ear mechanism that tells you, kind of give you balance, cerebellum. So vestibular, and also your spine, your eyes, all that information gets inputted here too, so that you can actually move about in space. You can have that correlation between where you are in space and what you're going to do about that. Okay. It also gets input not only from that, it also gets input from your proprioception. Into the parietal lobe. Proprioception is joint position sense. Joint position sense from your joint, so that anytime you move your finger, move your wrist, move your elbow, even with your eyes closed, you can tell that your elbow's bent. You don't have to see your elbow bent to know that it's bent because you have joint position sense. That all gets filtered into your parietal lobe as well. So your parietal lobe is really important in sensory info, in integrating all the different senses. And without the parietal lobe, you cannot affect what you're going to do with your environment, right? If you feel it's cold, you'll put a coat on. If you feel it's hot, you might take the coat off. So you do things based on the incoming information. Okay, so let's talk about then next, what can happen if the parietal lobe craps out? If your parietal lobe quits functioning because, why? Remember, fuel inactivation. You're not feeding your brain properly. If you're diabetic, you can have blood sugar issues. If you're anemic, you have leaky gut. If you're inflamed because of toxicity, if you're inflamed because of heavy metal poisoning, and I don't mean acute poisoning, I mean gradual accumulation over time. And a lot of people have this, okay? Or you are having some type of infection that can drive this inflammatory issue, that can all affect the parietal lobe. Or you lack activation. You're not moving, you're not being having properly stimulating the brain through, thoughts, or you have concussion, you have brain injury. That can all cause parietal lobe to not function. And the end result of parietal lobe not function is that you may develop hypersensitivity to touch or you may be very sensitive to pain. A lot of people have fibromyalgia not because they have pain in the muscle, it's because the brain cannot perceive their body properly, so then it's perceived as pain. So you can have central pain where the pain perception is perceived here because it's a wrong signal, right? This part of the brain, when it's not functioning properly, the threshold for pain can become decreased. So even light touch is like, ow, that hurts. Even just light touch. And people with fibromyalgia knows this. You get touched very lightly. People just put their hand on your shoulders like, wow, that's really sensitive. That may be a parietal lobe issue that have nothing to do with the muscle. The muscle may have nothing wrong with it, but it's a brain issue. Problem with parietal lobe can also lead to difficulty with spatial awareness when you're moving. So for example, you may park your car crooked, right? Every time you park, you park in a space, you think you're straight, you get out and look, it's like the car's crooked. It's like, what the heck, I thought it's straight. That may be a parietal lobe issue because you're not able to orient yourself in space. You may have impaired ability to integrate environment, so you may bump into the wall really easily. So you walk down a hallway, a narrow hallway, you might just always bump into one side because you're not just perceiving your space appropriately. So if you notice yourself bumping into walls a lot, that may be that. Or it could be something else. It could be a balance issue. That's got nothing to do with parietal lobe. But that's a possibility, and that's where you must take a very good history, ask the right question. Again, an experienced a neurologist, a functional neurologist like myself will be able to pick these symptoms out. And then you may also have trouble with left-right discrimination, meaning your parietal lobe helps you to tell you which side is left, which side is right. This has nothing to do with directional. It has to do north, east, south, west. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with your own body. You don't know which side's left, which side's right. This may be a parietal lobe issue. Your handwriting may become sloppier because you're not able to see the letters appropriately. So as you write, the words start out this way and may start to drip off, and instead of coming in a straight line with your words, the letters that you write may start to kind of drift off or get sloppier because you're just not able to visualize the letters, and then so the handwriting is sloppier. Not because of a lack of ability of your muscle to write, but because you're not seeing it. Okay, you may have other symptoms such as difficulty with basic math calculations. You may have trouble finding the words, either written or verbal. You may have difficulty recognizing symbols or words or letters. These are all parietal lobe symptoms. Now, what can we do about that? Because we always want to talk about solution, right? If you identify with some of these symptoms, you may have a parietal lobe issue. Again, this video or this show is not meant to, diagnose or treat or any condition. It's purely as educational purposes only. It may spur, your decision to consult with a functional neurologist like myself. And again, we do video Skype consultations all over the world with clients all over the world. So some of the things that you can do for parietal lobe, because the parietal lobe processes sensory information, that the modality, the way you want to stimulate the parietal lobe is by sensory, which means touch. So for example, massage is a great way to stimulate the body. So when you get massage therapy, that's a great way to stimulate the parietal lobe. Chiropractic adjustment, another great way to stimulate the parietal lobe. Especially even doing TENS units, electrical muscle stim, or doing ice or heat therapy. Anything that's touch or sensory based can stimulate the parietal lobe. You can get even more specific, and if we do a detailed analysis and assessment, we find that you have more of a right parietal lobe weakness, then we may want to do the stimulation on the left side of the body because the right brain controls the left side of the body. So by doing touch therapy on the left side of the body, you may stimulate the right parietal lobe more if that in fact was the side that was weaker. So this is where we'll get into more advanced applications. Another thing is that we can also do math calculations. So things like Sudoku may be good. It's good for frontal lobe as well, but also for the parietal lobe. More so the left parietal lobe. See, the left parietal lobe deals with numbers and also words because the parietal lobe deals with identifying letters and numbers and symbols. So doing math calculation or word search games help with the left parietal lobe. And then great games that you can do is recognition of symbols and shape. So, puzzle pieces are great. That's going to be great for the right brain. Those 10-gram puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, all deals with recognizing shapes and how to put it in a puzzle. that impacts pretty much the whole entire parietal lobe, maybe a little bit more on the right side. So those are some of the things you can do to activate or to stimulate the parietal lobe. But then again, remember always, you need to feed your brain properly first. Because if your brain lacks the capacity to even become stimulated, meaning you have poor blood sugar management, you're anemic, your methylation process is not working, you're lacking certain vitamins and nutrients, then what happens is your brain cells going to become weak to where even if you do those exercises to stimulate the brain, it's not going to really help. Kind of like, getting somebody to go to the gym and work out, but you never feed him any food. Well, the workout's not going to be that great, right? Or you put an athlete into a competition, but you never fed him the right food, this athlete's not going to perform as well as someone who has been properly fed and have proper nutrition. So same thing with the brain. You want to make sure you're feeding yourself properly so that when you do exercise your brain, the brain has the capacity to grow new neurons, right? Whatever you use, it gets stronger, but only if that part of the body is fed. Same thing with exercise. So you want to make sure you're having fuel and activation. And remember, another piece is inflammation. Don't underestimate how inflammation can negatively and adversely affect your brain function. And this is what we do with our neurometabolic integration program, where we're identifying these root causes utilizing advanced lab testing, so we know exactly what we're working on, and we help create a plan that'll help you get better. So if you have any questions, feel free to post any questions in the comment section below. I answer all the questions myself. If you like this video, if you feel it's helpful for you, please like this video and share this video so that people can get the help that they need. There's a lack of this type of information out there, and much of the information out there is too generic or just like, hey, everybody can benefit from doing the same thing. When in fact, there's a lot of customization that needs to happen, especially for people with chronic issue. If you've been trying things on your own, it's not working, it may be time to take the next step, working with a professional that has the experience and the expertise that will help you identify the root cause and make it a done-for-you program so you know exactly what you need to do to get the result you want. Again, you can email us at info@askdrkhan.com, or you can private message us on Facebook and request a case review. We'd love to get that process started. I'd love to be able to work with you and talk with you about your goals and help you make that transformation. Again, this is Dr. Peter Khan. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week at the Ask Dr. Khan Show.